皆さんこんにちは、国立西洋美術館研究員の川瀬祐介です。今日はここ国立西洋美術館で開催しますロンドンナショナルギャラリー展、をご紹介していただくことになりました。この展覧会は、世界で最も重要な美術館の一つであるロンドンナショナルギャラリーからなんと史上初めて館外でナショナルギャラリーの外で重要な作品を展示する作品展がここ日本で東京で実現することになりまして、その歴史的な展覧会を皆さんにご覧いただきたいと思っています。ロンドンのナショナルギャラリーは、ルネサンスから20世紀の頭までの大変幅広いコレクションを、しかも大変質の高いコレクションを所蔵していることで有名ですけれども、そのコレクションの性格を反映して今回の展覧会でもルネサンスからポスト印象派までさまざまな時代地域の作品を本当に傑作揃いの61点を通じてご紹介しようと思っています。今日はその中から重要なハイライトを皆様にご覧いただこうと思いますけれども、ご紹介いただく人をご紹介しましょう。ロンドンナショナルギャラリーの学芸部長でいらっしゃる私の隣にいますが、クリスティン・ライディングさんです。クリスティンさん、こんにちは。
Hello, my name is Christine Riding. I'm the Jacob Rothschild Head of the Curatorial Department at the National Gallery in London, and we are absolutely thrilled to be here at the National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo. This exhibition forms part of a very special year, UK and Japan 2019-20, and I'm about to take you on a tour of the exhibition, showing you some highlights from all 7 sections. So here we are in chapter 1 of the exhibition, collecting the Italian Renaissance, with this wonderful work of art by Carlo Crivelli, painted in 1486. Called The Annunciation with Saint Emidus. I'll come on to the subject of the painting in a moment, but I cannot overemphasize how important the Italian Renaissance was to the early collectors of the National Gallery when it was founded in 1824. In fact, I think of all schools of art, it was the Italians that the patrons and collectors of the National Gallery really focused upon. And this is an absolute prime example of the kind of work of art that they found absolutely exciting beyond the Titians, the Raphaels and so on, the sort of early Italian Renaissance that became so important in the 19th century. So this particular subject matter is an absolute core theme of Christian art. It is the Annunciation, the moment when the Archangel Gabriel comes to Mary, the Virgin Mary, to tell her that God has blessed her with a child with actually being a virgin, which was supposed to be the miraculous occasion that resulted in the birth of Jesus Christ. But just as the Gabriel is about to say this to the Virgin Mary, and just as the Holy Spirit is sending down this sort of, divine presence on the young woman to the right, the Gabriel is actually interrupted by the saint Emidus, who actually represents the Italian city of Ascoli. And on some level, this is a bit of a joke, the idea that you could actually interrupt in the streets of a Renaissance town the Archangel Gabriel actually going about his business. So there's a sort of a little in-joke here. And in part that relates to the little phrase at the front here, libertas ecclesiastica, which actually means religious liberty, because the town of Ascoli had actually been bestowed an amount of religious freedom, which actually is suggested by the fact that the patron saint can actually interrupt Gabriel in his business. So there's a sort of a little joke there going on in terms of the actual history of the town itself. But over and above the very core important religious subject of this particular painting is the fact that it's so decorative and so beautifully handled in terms of the perspective, the architecture, the scene of everyday life in a Renaissance town where a religious moment is occurring is really quite a wonderful juxtaposition. So even Mary herself is wearing 15th century fashionable dress for an Italian Renaissance woman, and you see people walking around the streets as a holy moment occurs, only seen by 2 people in the painting. The little girl up there on the left who peeks around to see what's going on, and then a gentleman towards the back who actually looks up rather astonished to see this ray of light coming in from the clouds. Again, a sort of humorous idea of something so dramatic and important happening in the streets of an Italian Renaissance town. And then over and above the tremendous decorative nature of the painting, the other thing that was really admired in Crivelli's work was his play on perspective and the dimensions of art. This is a flat work of art, and yet it continually moves into the viewer's plane, not least through this motifs at the front here of the apple and I think a sort of large cucumber of some sort that actually steps out into our dimension, making the painting that is at once flat seem extremely three-dimensional. So here we are in chapter 2 of the exhibition, the Dutch painting of the Golden Age, in front of this wonderful work of art by Johannes Vermeer of a young woman seated at a virginal, which was painted in about 1670-72. Before I talk about the painting, again, as with the Italian Renaissance, I just want to reiterate the fact that Dutch and Flemish works of art really do constitute a major part of the National Gallery's collection because of the emphasis in the 19th and 20th century on Dutch and Flemish works of art. So we are particularly rich with Dutch works of the 17th century, of which this is a prime example. So the scene itself is an absolute classic representation by Vermeer, who's extremely famous for these scenes of Dutch everyday life amongst the merchant classes of Holland and Netherlands. And what he's famous for is this genre of painting, which isn't strictly speaking portraiture, certainly not landscape, but actually showing everyday life. So on one level, what we're seeing here is a wealthy woman, a daughter perhaps of a merchant, dressed in silks, sitting at a virginals, which is a kind of keyboard, with the instruments in the foreground, with works of art on the back wall, and this wonderful curtain that's been drawn to one side to reveal her sitting at the virginals. But is this the daughter of a wealthy merchant, or is there something else going on in this painting? And that's what's really interesting about Vermeer and the way that people have studied him and talked about him, is what is actually going on. Because the painting on the back wall, which was a real work of art, which is now in the collection in North America, is actually entitled The Procuress, essentially a brothel keeper. So you see an older woman with a young woman talking to what is essentially her client. So in fact, you have a three-way relationship between a brothel keeper, a prostitute, and the client. So, in revealing this scene of a woman sitting playing at a musical instrument, are we looking at a wealthy merchant's daughter, or are we in fact looking at a prostitute? And that is the tension, the challenge, I suppose, in understanding this work of art. Because when you look at Vermeer's other paintings involving music, music isn't just a talent and something that's entertaining, it's also something that's often used to indicate the music of love or some sort of interaction that's occurring that could lead on to sexual relations. So in fact, the motif itself is extremely complicated and open to all kinds of different sort of conclusions. But it has to be said that Vermeer is one of the most popular artists in the 21st century for this rather wonderful palette that he uses with the blues and the yellows and these very quiet scenes of everyday life, but also because of how complicated and allegorical they can appear. But they also speak, I think, very eloquently of the Dutch Republic at the moment in the 17th century, when it was a tremendously powerful maritime nation that had built its enormous fortunes on trade and empire. So on one level, we have a very complex image about who are we looking at, but on the other, we have something that really does encapsulate the moment in the 17th century of this particular area of Europe that was fantastically wealthy because of its trade. So we're in chapter 3 of the exhibition entitled Van Dyke and British Portraiture, standing in front of this wonderful double portrait of the sisters Elizabeth and Dorothy. Elizabeth, the seated figure here, and it's likely that the portrait was painted to celebrate her marriage. And the reason why we know that is because she is being handed a basket of beautiful flowers by Cupid, a sort of mythological figure, of course, associated with love. And the flowers themselves are kind of bursting as if they've just opened. So the idea of it being handed to a bride in terms of her fertility and her ability to produce children to bless the marriage itself. So again, very symbolic in terms of the portrait itself. And the fact that the younger sister hasn't married means that she's slightly away from this dynamic of love and marriage. So that is the sort of dynamic, the composition of the painting. Now, it is almost, again, impossible to overstate how important Van Dyke is to British art. He's a Flemish artist of the 17th century who had already established himself as a major figure, both in terms of portrait painting and history painting in his native Flanders. However, like his compatriot Rubens, he had been enticed to come to London via the patronage of Charles I, a tremendously important royal patron of the 17th century. And indeed, Van Dyke turns up in 1632 to London, and he actually dies in London in 1641. But during that period, he transforms portraiture. Now, artists from abroad, and indeed native artists like William Dobson, for example, are actually painting in this manner. But for some reason, Van Dyke really touched something on the nerve, as it were, of the aristocracy of this period. He painted beautiful paintings with the silks and fabrics and the flowers and the textures that really glamorized the sitter. And indeed, I just wanted to point out one detail. The pearl earrings, double pearl earrings. Very rarely do you see those in portraits, but again, showing the wealth and status of the people in the portrait. However, there is something else that Van Dyke brings to these paintings that was tremendously seductive to his patrons. And that was, he brought to his portraits this kind of innate sense of nobility, of class, of status, of authority, that came across as entirely natural, that this wasn't something that was learned. You were born with these attributes. In the painting, whether or not you actually had those attributes in real life. And this quality of a society high-level portrait that brought together all these attributes of wealth and status, but it was innate to the sitter, something that was quite natural to them, ends up being a combination that continues in British art throughout the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, and even arguably into the 20th century. This was a formula that people really wanted to continue deploying, and hence why this section looks at the Flemish artist, but his impact on artists like Reynolds, Gainsborough, and indeed Lawrence in the latter part of the 18th century. So again, just an artist that has had a profound impact on British art in particular, and hence why he had to be represented at the National Gallery at Trafalgar Square. So we're now in chapter 4 of the exhibition, which is called The Grand Tour. And before I explain what we're looking at here, this wonderful painting by Canaletto, I should just explain what the Grand Tour is. So in the 18th century, any young gentleman of wealth and position would go on a tour of Europe for at least 2 years. The aim being that they would become better citizens and take up a public role once they returned, a little more knowledgeable about the world. So the absolute locus classicus of the Grand Tour was Italy, and there were 3 cities in particular that the Grand Tourist would go to. And that was Rome for the classical past, it was Florence for the Italian Renaissance, and Venice for pleasure. Because although Venice had been a mighty maritime empire, by the time we get to the 18th century, it is on the decline and is almost viewed universally as a kind of brothel of Europe. It's a place where you go for pleasure. Now, one of the artists that really becomes very important in that context of the British grand tourist is Antonio Canal, otherwise known as Canaletto, who was actually born in Venice. And this wonderful scene of the Grand Canal during the regatta was painted in about 1735. And you have this wonderful view, long view, down the Grand Canal towards the curve in the canal itself, which does exist, with just peeping to one side the Rialto Bridge, which at that point was the only bridge that went over the Grand Canal in entire Venice. However, and this is true of Canaletto's paintings, despite all the detail, which is true of present-day Venice, you would not be able to see the Rialto Bridge at that point in the canal. So he sometimes manipulated topography in order to create a wonderful view. Now, we know this is actually happening during the carnival season of February, because you can actually see in the foreground and elsewhere people actually dressing the traditional costume worn by masqueraders, of the bauta or the white mask, the tricorn hat and the little domino cape around the shoulders, and also because of the decorations that you see and the festival boats and stuff that you can actually see in the canal itself. Now, so popular were these paintings to grand tourists because essentially they were a kind of grand postcard or memento of the visit to Venice, that Canaletto literally couldn't produce enough of these paintings. And he actually worked through Consul Smith, who was a kind of ambassador, English ambassador in Venice at the time, who acted as his kind of dealer with the grand tourists. And when you go around Britain itself, you will come across many historic houses that have scenes like this because sons and fathers had been on their grand tour. Indeed, so reliant was Canaletto on his British patrons that he actually comes to London in England in the 1740s and starts creating similar views of London and elsewhere, around Windsor, for example, of English scenes, but very much in the manner as if they were in Venice. And indeed, we have a painting such as that in the exhibition itself. But again, just in terms of the importance of Canaletto and his impact on British art and culture, again, cannot be overemphasised. And indeed comes down to even his impact on 18th century cityscape painters, or vedute as these kind of works of art are known, and indeed very important in terms of the career of J.M.W. Turner, who absolutely adored Canaletto and adored Venice itself, which he visited many times. So again, if you're going to collect for a national collection, for the National Gallery, you must represent Canaletto because this artist had a profound impact on British art and culture. So we're now in chapter 5 of the exhibition called The Discovery of Spain, in front of this fantastic work of art by Goya, the court painter at the Spanish court in Madrid, of Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington. Now, in the 18th century, that was the moment when actually the British were discovering Spanish artists of the 17th century. So artists like Zurbrand and Murillo, or Murillo, as they call him in Spain, and also Velázquez, who's probably the most famous of the 17th century painters. But it really was the Napoleonic War period when there was so much disruption in Europe at the time that so many works of art were coming out onto the open market, particularly from Paris, that suddenly Spain really becomes a focus for British collectors. And this is particularly true of the Peninsular War, which happened in the area of Spain and Portugal. And this gentleman, Arthur Wellesley, was the Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces during that particular campaign that ended in 1812. And over and above the actual victory and defeat of Napoleon that war produced, and of course the bringing back of the Spanish monarchy in Madrid, is the opening up of Spanish art and culture to the rest of Europe. And suddenly everyone is really keen to acquire these works of art by artists that had been known but were not as famous as they really became during this particular period. Indeed, Arthur Wellesley, as a gift from the Spanish monarchy, was actually given numerous works of art by Spanish artists that are still in Apsley House today, which was his London home, including a wonderful work by Velázquez. Goya was a contemporary artist, of course, at the time that this portrait was painted. So this was really cutting-edge Spanish works of art in the period of 1812 or just afterwards. And indeed, Arthur Wellesley sat for this portrait after his triumphant entry into Madrid after the Battle of Salamanca that brought to the end of that particular war and reintroduced the Spanish monarchy. And what's really interesting about the painting is that in British art, at least, certainly of the 18th century, this would be a fairly standard half-length portrait of a major figure, which is indeed what we get. And Arthur Wellesley, his wealth and his rank is represented, of course, all over his uniform. These wonderful medals and orders of chivalry that have been bestowed on him in terms of gallantry, and his success in battle is blazoned all over his chest. And that's a fairly standard way of representing somebody, certainly a military figure. Indeed, the counterpart to Arthur Wellesley for the army in the Navy would, of course, be Admiral Nelson, and equally very famous paintings by him showing all these wonderful medals on his chest. However, what's really interesting about this painting is that Goya brings a degree of psychology to the face of Arthur Wellesley. This is not a triumphant figure such as one sees in other paintings with him on horseback or sort of leading the charge, you know, sort of a powerful military figure, but rather someone who has suffered from witnessing so much violence and bloodshed, and indeed is slightly perhaps weighed down by the stress of actually leading armies at such an important, crucial moment in European history, and hence the psychology, I think, of this particular portrait. But again, just in terms of representing the Spanish school, the artists of the 17th and early 18th century, we absolutely would have to have a painting by Goya, who was the court painter of the time. So we've now moved on to chapter 6 of the exhibition, Landscape and the Picturesque, and we're standing in front of a fantastic work of art by J.M.W. Turner, a British artist who was born in the 18th century and died in the middle part of the 19th century. And this section of the exhibition actually looks at landscape beyond British art. In fact, it looks at Dutch and French, all of which were of influence to this particular artist, Turner. Now, when people look at British art in particular, they think of landscape as being a quintessential genre in British art and culture, but it actually wasn't always the case. Indeed, for most of the 18th century, artists like Thomas Gainsborough, who made their fortune by being portrait painters, in fact wanted to be landscape painters, but they simply couldn't find the market or the patrons, mainly because British patrons were too busy buying French and Dutch works of art rather than those that had been painted by British talent. However, this transforms by the time Thomas Gainsborough dies in 1788, and indeed the mantle of British landscape and seascapes is taken up by Turner. Indeed, he transforms the genre into something that really becomes international. And it's very appropriate to be looking at this painting, which Turner produced at the height of his powers in 1829, because it is not only a classical subject matter, Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, the subject matter taken, of course, from Homer's Odyssey, hence underlining the influence of the classical tradition on British art and landscapes in particular, but also because it actually was influenced by an artist who's represented in this section of the exhibition, Claude Lorraine, the classical French artist of the 17th century. So again, it rather neatly encapsulates the impact of the kind of works of art that Turner would have seen as part of British culture, but also the growing collection of the National Gallery, which was formed in 1824, and this is a work of art that was painted 5 years later. So the actual subject, as I mentioned, is from Homer. You see actually Ulysses standing on the ship there, signalling with a torch in his hand towards Polyphemus, who is the classical Cyclops with a single eye in the centre of his forehead, who has captured Ulysses and his crew and prevented them from returning home after the Trojan Wars. Through various means, Ulysses blinds Polyphemus, so he is no longer able to capture the crew, and they make their way out as fast as possible in order to continue their journey, which is the moment that Turner shows us. And indeed what he sees is this dawn, as it were, of a new age perhaps for Ulysses and his crew, a dawn, actually a sunrise, a blazing sunrise, which is very much a kind of motif of Turner's works. The issue of sunrise and sunset used in Turner not just to create these wonderful, powerful visual works of art using amazing colours, which everybody commented on in the Royal Academy exhibition, where they would have seen this in 1829, but also he uses the motif of sunrise and sunset to suggest the turning over of time, the rise and fall of, for example, Polyphemus as opposed to Ulysses. But because we're looking at an inspiration from the classical tradition, the idea of a revered past turning through, as it were, into the present, and the idea of powers, of empires rising and falling. And of course, in 1829, this painting would have been exhibited at a moment when the British Empire really was on the rise, largely through its maritime and naval power. So during this period, and Turner knew this more than anyone, any representation of the coast or the sea during a period of maritime ascendancy would be viewed through this lens. It isn't simply a coastal scene or a seascape or a rather charming image of a classical past, it also has impact on the present. So that is why this kind of painting would have had particular impact on British audiences of the time. Now, why this painting is particularly important for the National Gallery's collection is that Turner, when he saw this growing collection, eventually, of course, from 1838 at Trafalgar Square, he started to think about his own legacy and position in British art and culture, but also his position within this old master tradition that was growing at the National Gallery. So he decided very early on, in fact, in this year of 1829, to actually start thinking of donating works of art to the nation after his death, which actually occurred in 1851. So he was trying to think through his own legacy and position within the growing national collection. And this was a painting that he already had in his mind that would form part of that bequest. So eventually, in 1856, the Turner bequest, which actually ended up being thousands of works of art from Turner's own studio, ended up being part of the national collection, the majority of which were going on display throughout the 19th century at the National Gallery itself. And of course, this painting has always taken pride of place in the main displays. So we're in the chapter 7 of the exhibition French Modern Painting in Britain, and I'm going to talk to you about this painting, a very famous work of art by Vincent van Gogh of the sunflowers from the National Gallery's collection, which was painted in 1888 when Van Gogh was in Arles in southern France. He did actually paint a number of sunflower paintings, some in Paris, in fact, just before he went to south of France, and some when he was there. And they were very much paintings and the subject matter that was associated with Van Gogh himself, both personally, but also his relationship with Paul Gauguin. And indeed, this painting and others were created to decorate the guest room that was intended for Gauguin when he arrived in the autumn of 1888. Unfortunately, that relationship, that artistic and professional relationship, didn't go so well in the south of France, and in fact, Gauguin left early. But Gauguin continued to be inspired and excited by the motif of the sunflowers. Indeed, he actually collected some of Van Gogh's paintings. And he very much, and indeed so did Van Gogh, actually see it as very much a personal motif of the artist himself. And I think for some reason the two artists realized that this particular subject matter was going to really establish Van Gogh as a major international artist. And indeed that has proven to be the case. Indeed, when there was a major exhibition of Van Gogh's paintings in 1923, this painting was on display. And fortunately for the United Kingdom, a fund had actually been set up to acquire specifically Impressionist and Post-Impressionist works of art via Samuel Courtauld, who's a fantastically important collector of this kind of art. And in 1924, the painting was indeed acquired, but only after Vincent van Gogh's sister-in-law, Joanna, had finally relented over the pressure that was put on her to sell this painting to the National Gallery and the Tate, which were co-institutions to actually sell it to them. And she actually felt a very personal connection with this particular painting and others of this subject because it was so much identified with Van Gogh himself. But eventually, because she was a trustee of the estate of Vincent van Gogh, she realized that actually to really establish his reputation and his legacy, that these kind of works of art needed to be seen internationally. So she relented and the painting came into the collection in 1924. And that's the end of the tour, and I really hope that people that come to the exhibition have a wonderful experience and indeed are inspired not just to go around the collection here, but to come to London and see us at the National Gallery.